I found this case really interesting and kind of creepy. So when I went to research it more, I realized that they actually made a video about it already, and it's one of their best videos yet. And I highly recommend checking it out because they covered way more than I did in this video. But I'm going to tell my version of this story. In the middle of the night, somewhere in the United States, a lone car drives down an empty country road. It parks by a dark and eerie creek, and the driver's side door is left open. Inside the vehicle is the key to the door, and also to the ignition. In the moments before dawn, someone is seen walking away from the car, and their footprints are left in the soft mud by the water's edge. The prints eventually fade away into nothingness, and the person is never seen again. This is the terrifying ordeal of the disappearance at Hollow Creek. This mysterious incident occurred in the rural town of Alton, Kentucky. The year was 1979. To reach the small town, you have to drive down a single-lane road which runs parallel to a branch of the Ohio River known locally as Hollow Creek. On the night of June, local resident Robert Chaffin drove home along this lonely road. It was around midnight, and he was alone in his car. For some strange reason, he turned off the engine but left the key in the ignition and the car in gear. He then opened up the driver's side window and stepped out of the car. He walked over to the nearby creek and looked into the dark water. Then he wandered back to his car and got in again. The whole episode was recorded by the police as part of a missing persons report, but no one knows what Robert was doing or why he decided to do whatever it was he did next. According to a witness, a few minutes later, a friend of Robert's, Billy Thomas, drove past in his car and saw Robert standing outside of his vehicle with the door open and the lights on. Billy assumed that Robert had broken down and needed some help, so he stopped to see if he could assist his friend. However, when he got out of his car, he noticed something strange. Robert's car was in gear, and the parking brake was not engaged. As Billy approached the vehicle, it rolled forward and crashed into a ditch beside the road. Shaken but unharmed, Billy managed to get the car out of the ditch and pushed it back onto the road. Then he called for Robert to come back to his car so they could figure out what happened. But Robert was nowhere to be seen. His body has never been recovered, and he has never been heard from again. To this day, there are many questions surrounding this bizarre case. What happened to Robert's car? Why did he leave it in gear? What was he doing at the creek? And most importantly, where is he now? At first, the police were inclined to believe that Robert simply drove off and abandoned his car after getting drunk. However, this theory doesn't really make sense. According to Billy, Robert was sober, and neither man had any history of drinking. Additionally, there were no signs of a struggle and no indication that Robert's car had been tampered with. The doors were unlocked and the windows were rolled down. If Robert had left the area willingly, it's likely he would have taken his wallet, his glasses, and his shoes. But he didn't. Everything was left right where he had left it. Another oddity of this case was the footprint. When the police arrived at the scene, they discovered a pair of wet footprints in the MUD near Robert's abandoned car. The footprints appeared to be heading away from the car and toward the darkness beyond. But they quickly faded away and were gone after only a few dozen feet. It's unclear how long these tracks had been there, but they certainly weren't fresh. The mud was dry in places, indicating that they had been made hours earlier. The police were baffled as to what they could possibly mean. Could they lead them to Robert's body? Or was there something else going on here? When asked about the tracks, Billy said that Robert didn't own any shoes that matched the imprints and that he wasn't wearing any shoes when he saw him last. This was confirmed by the fact that there was only one set of footprints, even though Robert was known to wear two different styles of footwear. There was also no sign of any other vehicles in the area, and given that the nearest house was over a mile away, it was unlikely that anyone else would have been walking by. These facts led investigators to conclude that whoever made the footprints was still in the area. They searched everywhere they could think of, but they never found anything. The case went cold, and it seemed like the truth would die with Robert. That is until one day in July, nearly 3 weeks after the original incident, Two fishermen were casting their lines into Hollow Creek when they heard what sounded like a woman screaming in the darkness. The sound was loud and echoed across the water. They couldn't quite make out the words, but it sounded like she was calling for help. Terrified, the men grabbed their paddles and began rowing to the opposite shore. As they moved through the fog, they could hear what sounded like faint whispers coming from the trees. When they finally reached the bank, they couldn't see anything in the thick underbrush, but they continued to hear the whispering voices. Concerned for their safety, the fishermen grabbed their things and ran back to their boat. As they hurried through the fog, they could hear their own footsteps and the sound of their own breathing. And then suddenly they felt something wet and cold squish between their toes. Startled, they shone their flashlight into the darkness and gasped in horror at what they saw. Standing in the water up to her knees was a pale woman. She had completely black eyes, dripping wet hair, and a look of sheer terror on her face. She was hunched forward with her head almost touching the ground, and she wasn't making a sound. In a panic, the men retreated to their boat and paddled furiously away from the shore. They never looked back, but they could feel the woman's eyes boring into their skulls. They told the police everything they had seen, but they refused to go back to the creek to identify the woman. Of course, when the officers arrived at the scene, all they found was a pair of footprints in the mud, identical to the ones from Robert's case. To this day, no one knows who the woman was or where she came from. Some say she was Robert's wife, while others say she's the ghost of a girl who drowned in the creek decades ago. Some say she's a creature of the night, while others say she's the work of a deranged killer. So what do you think really happened here? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.